afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last panel of the afternoon, the copyright panel. Woohoo. I am really happy to be here with this group of people and all of you. The overarching topic of discussion today has been IP and national success, and we're going to continue that theme. You might notice that we've had a little bit of a change of lineup. We were expecting Maria Palante, and she got stuck sitting in the airport all day long and finally gave up around 12:30 when she was told that she would be on a plane that would not actually get here in time for the panel. So we have Danielle Van Lier joining us in Maria's stead. And Danielle is an attorney and adjunct professor at multiple law schools in LA. And she'll tell us more about her background as well as we start up. Next to Danielle, we have Eric Priest, who's a professor at University of Oregon School of Law and a senior scholar at the IP Policy Institute. Next to Eric, we have John Garon, who is Associate Dean for Technology and Innovation and Director at the Goodwin Program for Society, Technology, and the Law, and Professor of Law at Nova Southeastern University, Shepard Broad College of Law. And he's a senior scholar with us at the IP Policy Institute. And next to him, we have Rama Elluru, who is Senior Director and Special Competitive Studies Project at the Special Competitive Studies Project. So we'll get going right away. So in the copyright arena, as all of you probably have noticed, there's no hotter topic than AI. So accordingly, we've gathered this group here to close out our day with a discussion on copyright, AI, and national competitiveness. And as our panel description suggests, we're used to speaking about national competitiveness and IP policy by quoting statistics and talking about how much our innovation and creative industries contribute to the economy. And it's important, of course, to be cognizant of those sorts of things. But this afternoon, our panel is going to stretch beyond that realm, and we're going to examine national competitiveness more broadly. And we're actually going to take it even a step further and talk about copyright policy, AI, and its impact on national security as well. So before we do that, though, I'd like to begin by getting to know our panelists by understanding their priors when we're talking about these issues and what shapes their views on this topic. So I'm just going to go down the row here and start with Rama, if you can
Thank you.
Yourself.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, IPPI, for including me here. So my background, I've worked at the intersection of intellectual property law, specifically patent law, AI policy, tech policy, and AI governance. And in those spaces, it's you constantly see the pattern. Innovation doesn't start with big companies, industry. It starts with individuals, a person tinkering with a new model, a writer drafting a story, a musician building a sound. And only later does that creativity scale into an industry. And while I'm not telling you something you don't know already, it really does, you can't put too much emphasis on the human. While working on competitiveness and innovation policy, it became clear that leadership isn't just about the industry. It's about having a system that continuously produces new creators, innovators, entrepreneurs. And if any layer of that innovation system weakens, the whole system crumbles. And also AI governance sharpened that framing for me as well. AI systems are built from human-generated knowledge, data, culture. They're trained. AI models are trained on the accumulated output of millions of creators. So when we talk about AI policy, we are really talking about the human foundation that makes those systems possible. And that's where I come at it from. And so to me, protecting creators isn't just about a cultural or moral imperative, it's a strategic one. If individuals, human creators, lose bargaining power or lose lose complete control over the bargaining power, or lose sustainable income, then over time you just don't harm the individual, you erode the innovation system itself. So I think healthy industries depend on healthy creators. And in the age of AI, keeping humans at the center of the innovation system isn't just symbolic, it's foundational to national security and long-term national competitiveness.
Thank you. John?
So delighted to be here. Thank you so much. Thanks to Mark and everyone at IPPI. It's been a great conversation so far. Going back to kind of my roots, right, because this is my home. I grew up in community theater, in the oldest children's theater company in the United States, and I was a theater major undergrad, picked my law school because of the relationship of the law school to the theater program, which is why I did not end up initially at UCLA, because they were offended that I even asked the question. I also grew up in a small family business, and as that small family business, I designed products, and our IP strategy, we didn't call it that, we had no language for it, but we were a name goods company, and both patent innovation and copyright, trademark, those things drove our business, but it also drove the entire industry out of the United States. And so we were the last American knitting mill in the United States. So I saw what happens when you fail to protect. And it was a three-generation business for us, but we had employees in that town that were 5 generations, all working for our family business. None of that is part of the U.S. economy today, so I felt that very personally. In law school, I worked for Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts and was able to see how being a lawyer and an entertainment lawyer could really make that transition. And I've continued to do that work, but expanded into technology, fell in love with teaching as an adjunct, became a faculty member, associate dean, now associate dean again. And so for me, it's all about the infrastructure for creativity, what it takes for individual artists to succeed, and something we talked about on the call, that we think about the copyright community as, very often we romanticize it and it's the novelist alone in her room, but as we heard at lunch, right, thousands of Imagineers come together to create this space. And so it's a highly collaborative process that involves creators across the spectrum. And there's just as much creativity in how to design the next handbag or how to cut the next black dress as there is in the next Broadway show. So we really need to think about the creative industries in a much broader way and realize just how fundamental they are to the economy. And if we don't have the right infrastructure for that, then what we give up is vastly more than just a competitive challenge with China.
Thanks, John, and thank you, Sandra. Again, I'm Eric Priest. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law. Before becoming an IP lawyer and then ultimately a law professor, I actually worked for 10 years in the creative industries as a songwriter and a producer. I made my living doing that. I was a recording studio owner so kind of developed a firsthand appreciation for what creative professionals do, how the creative process works, how entrepreneurial the creative process actually is. In fact, part of my work as a scholar, I've written on the connection between authorship and entrepreneurship, the idea that every author, in a sense, is a speculator. You never know where what you set out to create that day or that month is going to end up. You have no idea if there will be a market for it, an audience for it, any of that. And I lived that every day for a decade. I then studied Chinese, got interested in China, moved to China, and I actually worked in the Chinese music industry as early as 1999. So it was a very sort of nascent industry, and indeed nascent copyright regulatory regime and environment. And so I kind of learned at that time a whole new set of challenges for creators. And so after becoming a lawyer and ultimately a law professor, I then focused on Chinese copyright and the Chinese or the environment for creative industries in China. And so a lot of my scholarship has been around what lessons we can take about copyright in general by looking at environments where there are serious challenges with copyright enforcement, and as sort of was discussed on the last panel in relation to patents. If the rights, the exclusive rights, are not well enforced or not very enforceable, what does that mean for the not only the property right, not only the copyright regime, but also what does it mean for the entire creative ecosystem and creative industries? The last thing I'll say, because it's directly related to this panel, is my more recent research has been on music and music industry in the United States, and in particular, what a creative class of professionals, and in my most recent research I've been doing with Sean Pager at Michigan State University, what does that mean for sort of music? So creative professionals in the music industry. How important are professionals today in an era where many copyright scholars sort of argue, hey, you can just flip open a laptop, fire up GarageBand, and you've got a professional recording studio at your fingertips, and press a few buttons, you distribute it to the world. We don't need intermediaries. We don't need expensive, cost-intensive recording processes, and therefore maybe we don't need sound recording copyrights. So part of what we looked at is are AI solutions replacing recording professionals? And so I'm happy to talk about that later in the panel, but I don't want to occupy too much time.
Yeah, no, I'll definitely ask you to talk about your research in a bit. And Danielle.
Well, I was really looking forward to watching this panel. I didn't
Now you get a bird's eye view.
Yes, now I'm like right in the mix.
Yeah.
So, I'm not as prepared as the others, but a little bit on my priors. I grew up in a creative family. My grandfather was a studio musician. My babysitter or mother's helper, nanny type person ended up on a soap opera. And, my cousins are both artists. So I think when I, got out of college, didn't know what to do with my degree in Japanese law school and decided to go to law school, it seemed inevitable that I would end up in this, in these creative industries, and also helping creators. I'm also a creator myself. I have a side business doing, selling landscape and wildlife photography. I am a screenwriter, although I haven't had anything made yet, obviously, but working on it. So I come at this often with, multiple different perspectives. I spent pretty much most of my career at SAG-AFTRA. You may have heard of the little disruptions that happened a few years ago. But I rode through multiple different strikes in my time there. I started in the midst of one strike, and then there was the big Writers Guild strike, and then 2023, and those almost all of them had at their core disruptive technology in some respect. It was, the 2007, was it, strike, was about streaming, and changing things. And then obviously 2023, it had to do with AI. And that also seemed like a good time to leave. But I really came to this topic. I've been working on IP and image rights and all that stuff through most of my career. But the AI topic really, took hold when I went back to school in 2016 to do an LLM in innovation, technology, and the law. And I was finishing that just as deepfakes were becoming a thing. And it seemed like a natural course to take take my expertise that I've been working on for the last decade plus and spin that into my dissertation. So my dissertation ended up being on the various threats posed by deepfakes. So that is where I really started digging deep into this topic. Trying to think about what else I wanted to say, but I think that was and then over the last couple years, I pitched to Southeastern, and now I teach it also at Loyola and USC, a class on AI in the entertainment industry, which is quite a challenge to keep up with. But yeah, I teach that class now at 3 schools, and I'll be teaching it this summer in London through Southeastern's program. And I also teach a class on the entertainment guilds, which of course covers new technologies. So I'm pretty much in the mix of it. I think I spend more time teaching than actually practicing, even though I'm running my own practice now. But I think that's about enough for me.
Great, thank you. So all of you, I think, have referred in introducing yourselves and your priors to what national success in IP means to you a little bit. But maybe I can ask you that question more directly and ask you to also respond to it by answering how you think about and characterize the AI marketplace in broad terms. For instance, do you think about AI as a fundamental break or shift from past technology? Is it something that we've never encountered before? Is it more of a technological evolution? And, what does that mean for you in terms of how you think about copyright policy and AI policy as a result?
So I think copyright does more than govern creative markets. It also shapes the power in the innovation ecosystem. And I think that's accelerating, AI is accelerating that balance. National security policy increasingly operates through economic and regulatory tools. So we're seeing IP policy become embedded in places that we don't normally see, trade negotiations, AI standard setting, and tech governance frameworks. I think it's important how we balance that power balance, how we structure that power balance, because it determines who's going to be able to create, who's going to have leverage in negotiations, who can afford compliance, and who can scale. I think traditionally, it's the large, well-capitalized stakeholders who are able to absorb uncertainty and unclarity and lack of clarity. So I think it's important now that AI is accelerating this balance, that we make sure that, again, human creators are elevated or at least protected. The allocation of risk and uncertainty is going to shape the new generation of innovators. So I think that's where I come from. I think AI sort of, like I said, accelerates that imbalance that we've seen traditionally.
And are you seeing it differently than past kind of iterations of technology, or is this just kind of a new iteration of something that we've seen before?
I think it's a new iteration, but there's more stakes on the table.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure, I'll jump in next. There's two really different pieces. What is IP success? And then what is AI going to do to it? Rephrasing the question just a little bit. So for me, again, I really come, and I think you hear this from a lot of us, but I really come from that perspective of the individual creator and the collective individual creators. And for the individual creator, success is sustainability, right? So if, just looking at the numbers of just kind of in awe of being here. So I was looking at the numbers and the size, the comment this morning that the size of Disney World is the size of Manhattan made me ask the question, how does the entertainment industry compare? And there are more performers on Disney World, not the Disney company, in Disney World than all of Broadway and off-Broadway, right? So that gives you a sense of the potential for scale. And if you look at, right, the reason that I'm a film lawyer and technology lawyer is because living in New York as a law student, I realized, and producing as a writer and producer in New York, that it is an unsustainable business model. We don't call those venture capitalists, we call those angels, because it is an unsustainable business model. And if the creative industries in America become Broadway, opera, and ballet, then we have failed, right? Creative industries have to speak to the popular culture. They need to sustain tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers. They are, as we heard in the first program, the soft power that the U.S. has used to export democracy and free speech and equality as our universal values as a country, and we have used the media industries to export that version of the world since World War II. So there's a tremendous amount of stake if we lose that creative industries. And as an educator, I am deeply, deeply concerned that AI is an existential threat because, as Eric talks about in the work of professionals, you don't create a professional unless you've spent a lot of time and effort working as a kid in junior high and high school and college, developing these skills that then lead you onto a professional path. And if we've made it so easy to push a button and compete with those kids, then we're going to take the ladder away and we're going to undermine that. I'm a big fan of Marshall McLuhan. The media is the message, and we saw how television revolutionized the world, books revolutionized the world. AI is that much more transformative than either of those two inventions. And so I think we really are at a cusp where we have none of the public policy discussions in the right place for the right reasons right now. And so I do have that kind of deep, deep fear. There's also some con law stuff that I'll talk about, but I'll leave that for the later conversation.
I know.
Either way.
Okay. So I'll address, I think, first, I completely agree with how John has kind of positioned this question of what is success. I think that that having a professional class of creators is incredibly important. And sort of on the theme of this panel, it's important for not just the success of the entertainment industries, which is alone and important enough, right? But there are national, broader national interests, national security interests. John mentioned the soft power interests. I mean, being a leader in the development and exporting of culture is incredibly important, and this just doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen in an intentional way, and it doesn't happen in a high quality way if you don't have people who devote their lives to this. And so the idea of amateurism, and AI plays into this, right? You'll hear, so I focus, like I said, primarily on the music industry, and you'll hear people who are promoting sort of AI music production tools. And by the way, if you haven't looked into AI music production tools like Suno and Udio. Suno and Udio, these are sort of two AI music production software suites. Just look up a YouTube video on, say, on Suno. The music and sort of the audio finished product that it produces is flabbergasting. It's that amazing and that impressive. And so I do think we are this is a fundamental technological shift. Nothing like that has ever existed, where you literally can choose a style, put in a very basic prompt, and it will generate 4 or 5 versions of a song that many people, only to very, very trained ears, and sometimes not even in that case, can identify it as not having been human created and human performed. Everything's generated by AI.
Can I ask you a question? So we're defining success here, and what does success look like? And I am a total copyright nerd, and I agree. Professional creative class is absolutely necessary. But you've just described a fantastic technological product. Yeah. Isn't that success too?
So, well, I mean, it's certainly success in the sense that it's an impressive technology. Mm-hmm. The question is, does that advance some of the other goals that we've talked about? Because part of what I'm talking about is sort of the intentionality, right, of creativity. That when you have people who are great at creating, they produce things that are as one. So I'll just get briefly into an empirical project that I mentioned at the outset that I've been doing with Professor Sean Pager at Michigan State. We just published an article on this, and one of the things we've been looking at is to what extent do you see, so setting aside the AI question for a second, to what extent do you see just amateur DIY creators producing successful recordings? And we looked at, basically the top 200 charts over a 3-year period. And we found that they're virtually non-existent. Like virtually every song that has is part of the cultural zeitgeist, that's part of the that reaches the top 200, and as far as we can tell, most likely even deeper than that. There are professionals involved. It's sort of the kind of purely DIY productions are unicorns. So this kind of amateurism aspect seems not to have developed in the music industry in the way that many people had predicted. So how does that relate to AI? Well, one of the questions that we looked at is, is AI replacing recording professionals? And as far as we can tell, it's not. And part of that is because at least for higher level creative productions, even the recording process, even those technical processes, all require a tremendous amount of creativity and skill in thinking about how something will be shaped, the message, not just the lyrics or the musical message, but even the sonic, right, or auditory kind of the impact that it has on the listener. Those are all creative choices that are made. Now, so you would think that maybe now with, for example, AI audio production, that has seeped in and kind of taken over the roles of professionals. But in fact, as I said, what we've seen is that in fact, we've talked to independent record labels, and they've said, we pay more for mastering and mixing now than we ever did before. As far as we can tell, there are more people doing this now than ever before, despite the fact that some of these AI tools have been around for almost a decade now, and they're getting better and better all the time. People are still paying for professionals. So part of that we really view as expertise still matters. People who are really expert at this know, right? An AI can sort of generate something that is, again, backward looking, that kind of creates a work that mimics what successful works have done in the past. But that's often not what makes a work successful. In fact, as one of our engineers talked about, it's the element of surprise. She was a Grammy-winning mix engineer who said, oftentimes, I'll come up with something maybe unintentionally that totally changes the sound of the song and turns it into a huge hit, right? So I think it's kind of this, it's knowing how to, what elements are likely to work, and also having that kind of, really I think there's still, and it's, hard to quantify this, but I think there is still an element of human creativity that audiences pick up on, but it's getting harder, right? It's getting harder to tell. Did you want to add?
So I'm probably going to say some things that I wouldn't have said like a year and a half ago, and definitely not 2 years ago when I was at my other job. So as far as success goes, I definitely don't agree with the billionaire tech moguls who define it based on the balance sheet and power and all that stuff. I don't think that's how we should be measuring success when it comes to AI. I don't agree with the national plans for it, where it's all about global dominance, although there are certainly very valid national security concerns. I have some very significant concerns when it comes to national security with misinformation and deepfakes and all of that. I think that very much has to factor into the mix. But to the earlier points, I think it's both a tech evolution, or not necessarily something new, but also it is how would I say this? Well, I think it's a tech evolution, but it's a very, very unusually disruptive one. But when you really look at it, every new technology, going back to the printing press, it's why we have copyright, right? Is that, or at least strong copyright. It's what, in order to protect the works from being copied at scale that we didn't have before the printing press when they were handwritten. And, the weaving machines that the Luddites fought against because it was going to take their jobs. We've had countless technological revolutions throughout history. We've survived, we have to adapt every time it happens. I do think this one is hitting home a little bit more because it is dealing with intellectual property as opposed to physical labor, and it's making us think of it in a different way than we do typically when, we're disrupting what we would see as like blue collar workers, as now we're disrupting the white collar class. So I think that has kind of shifted some of the perspective on this, and also just the scale of it as well. Because one of the things, to use Facebook's old motto, it's moving fast and breaking things. They're not really considering the impact of what they're doing. I think some of the companies like Anthropic is doing a much better job of that than, say, OpenAI. But they seem to be just like, it's all about who can be the biggest, fastest, best, et cetera, without really considering the ramifications of that and without being fully transparent. I mean, it's, they don't even know how these things work. So there's that element to it. And as a sci-fi nerd, we all know where this goes. Skynet only took 3 months to destroy humanity. So it's, there's that side of it. I think, that it's not like we shouldn't be somewhat prepared because authors have been speculating about this all along. But I think where I'm going to diverge a little bit from what the others have said, and I can't believe I'm saying this, I certainly, like a year ago, me wouldn't have said this, but I think a lot of it depends on how it's being used as well. I mean, I have my issues with the training, and I think there's a question where I'll discuss that afterwards. But it's also creating new forms of creativity. And I'm not just talking about the AI slop that is filling up our social media feeds, But I have somebody who had been a guest speaker at my class a couple times, who runs like an online school with classes on how to do AI filmmaking and stuff like that. And he's told stories about people who were ready to give up the industry entirely and then got their hands on some of these tools and were able to create short films that they never could have created before. So, it is fueling new things. And I even think about like my own photography. I was at the parks yesterday, and this is like more consumer level stuff. But I had taken a picture, Epcot had been on my bucket list as a kid. So I took kind of that iconic picture of the dome, but there was like someone there in my way. And with a quick click in a little circle of it, I was able to delete it on my phone in like 2 seconds, which using Photoshop a few years ago would have taken considerable time to do that. So, I think it's empowering a lot. And it's like for my class, even one of the things I do is set up a section of discussion boards where I give the students like some sample prompts and say, go try to write a song on Suno. And I've had it do write a song about our class, on Suno and post it for everybody just so that they can understand how these tools work. And, it comes up, I wrote one about my cat and stealing my seat, just silly stuff that I never could have done before. But I do agree, where I do 100% agree, is the impact it is having on existing creative professionals and, creators, the work we do, and, maintaining that. I'm very a big proponent of human in the loop all the time. And I think we have to just consider all these things. So to me, what success in AI, in national success in AI means is, ethical AI that respects human creativity, that respects people entirely, because we all know that there's tons of bias issues built into it, that has appropriate guardrails, whether it's, for intellectual property, for image and voice rights, and et cetera. So that it's, to me, that's success is that, it is AI with humanity, I guess, not necessarily the balance sheet.
Yeah. And so that's what I was trying to probe a little bit when I said, isn't that technology an example of success? Not the use of the technology necessarily by an amateur to create, a song about a class or a cat or whatever, because it might be cute for us to share it amongst ourselves, but it's not going to replace, a song that is popular, in that moment in the zeitgeist, right? We still want that from the professional class. But the fact that the technology exists and allows us to not just use it as an entertainment product, but that same technology may be powering medical decisions, may be powering creative decisions in other fields that we do want to see. And that's, I guess, what I'm asking is, are there ways to empower both? And I know, Rama, you've had experience in the patent field. What can we learn from that?
Sure. So I also just want to point out that, a lot of industries are struggling with these questions.
Yeah.
A lot of industries are struggling with this exact question. So success is also how we adopt and integrate these tools so that we raise the boats for everyone. That is what every previous technology has also challenged us to do. So I think that is a lever also in shaping IP policy, is how we use these tools. But I think in the patent realm, it's some of the same issues. You just change patent to copyrights. We've faced legal uncertainty in the last 15 years in the patent world. And legal uncertainty is typically absorbed by well-capitalized institutions. And so the harm, for a lack of a better word, is typically uncertainty is typically felt by the small inventor, the solo inventor. And I think that's the same thing that's happening here in the copyright world. And so I think clarity is a form of policy support, and that's certainly true in the patent world, and I think that's also going to be true in copyright and AI. The same principles apply. Developers need clear expectations. Creators need predictable incentive structures, and I think that's really the balance that is the challenge to answer.
So first, a fairly esoteric view of what change means. So if we look at the printing press, right, we keep coming back to, well, we've had these revolutions before. The printing press leads almost directly over the course of half a century to the Protestant Reformation, to the collapse of all the monarchies across Europe and the rise of modern democracy. It was the people fleeing from the English revolutions and civil wars that were on the Mayflower and led to the Americanization, the Westernization of North America. So we are all the beneficiaries of that incredible change, but a lot of people died to get us here, right? A lot of transformative change happened that was incredibly painful. So it's not necessarily that AI is going to be good or bad, but the level of disruption could be at a scale similar to the printing press, right? And that scale is something that I don't think we ever thought to fathom. The other thing I want to just reinforce is, of course, we keep coming back to generative AI. And of course, AI goes back to the 1950s. There are many, many kinds of AI technologies well beyond generative AI. They have great scientific uses. They have great robotics uses. They're also going to transform the way that war is waged. And we're seeing that, right, that has a transformative use that's not relevant to this panel, but we better think about the fact that every military in the world is figuring out how to remove some portion of the humans on the battlefield and replace those with technologies, battling technologies. But I also think that it's pretty clear that LLMs are a dead-end technology, and in fact, other technologies built on them and built on those other predictive models are the technologies that will lead to AGI, general artificial intelligence, that we're on the cusp of developing. And so again, when we think about what the workforce is going to look like 10, 20 years ago, and the ability to have, essentially full employment as a nation, to be able to be a leader in the global economy, we have to think about this not from the, what's going to happen over 18 months, but where is this going to our education program, to our workforce, to our development, and to the economy at a really fundamental level. And I think that as we zoom out, we have to look at true revolutionary eras to realize just how disruptive it is and start getting Capitol Hill and other policymakers to plan for a level of transformation that we've never seen before.
I think you raise an interesting point, John, about the Protestant Reformation and how these things have impacted change. And I fully believe that's why things are going the way they are right now, is that we do have, Silicon Valley is kind of run by, people who would love to have a techno-oligarchy, a technocratic form of government. And I think we are moving, like it or not, in that direction. It definitely poses some interesting challenges. I don't know that, I never thought Idiocracy was going to be a documentary or so prophetic, or WALL-E. I mean, we're moving to the world of WALL-E, right? The humans lived in at that point. But we also, at least here in the US, have such an individualistic society that we don't have the infrastructure that would allow us to move to those kind of to that kind of world. And I think it's something that, whether it's through, both, we're seeing like creatives are the first line, right? That is being, but we've already, like I said, we've already seen it with like robots taking jobs and other things. And it's just moving really fast.
So you've commented already about what we risk if we don't get the balance right on AI IP policy and how that affects the economy as a whole. One thing that we've seen, at least the creatives using to try and affect IP policy is litigation, right? And so let's take these issues from another direction and think about litigation and litigation as a tool to affect our ability to get to the right policy answers. Is class action copyright litigation an effective tool for resolving complex policy disputes? And if it isn't, what do we have?
Yes and no, I think. I think on the yes side, it certainly helps hasten things. I mean, we see it companies care about risk, right? And so if the risk is that they're going to pay $1.5 billion in a settlement, they're going to pay more attention than if they're just, having individual creators trying to negotiate things. But I think what I've found really interesting, like in putting together my course materials for this semester, was we had these decisions in Bartz and Kadri about that we're operating from an assumption for the most part that the AIs are not memorizing the works, quote unquote, memorizing it. And now, just less than a year later, studies have come out that saying yes, in fact, they are memorizing, and that at least to some degree. So in that sense, that's one area where I think that litigation is not effective, because now we have two pretty, these two decisions that people have latched onto that may not have had even the right analysis, let alone the right outcome. So I think this is one of those areas where the technology is moving so quickly that, one, the law is not keeping up, certainly not here because of the way our government operates. I think we're seeing more around the world. We're seeing much more better pace of regulation. But we also are seeing, decisions that are coming out that are potentially based on flawed information. And, what's interesting is that you had Bartz that was a class action and Kadri that wasn't. So you have two different, these different, and two very different judicial approaches to getting to their fair use analysis. So, in one sense, I think class actions are not necessarily the right vehicle because of the way the technology is, that you're going to have these determinative judgments that impact the entire class when it may not have been based on the correct information, I guess is what I'm getting at. But legislation moves too slowly. So I don't know what the other alternative is right now.
I agree that legislation moves slowly, but I do think policymakers can play a part here. And I think policymakers, they understand issues like workforce, how this is going to impact the labor market in terms of human creators. They understand antitrust issues, how this impacts concentration of power. So I think policymakers can play a part here where it's necessary. I think they would like to see economic modeling data, facts, economic modeling data about how this affects the innovation ecosystem. And I think that would also be helpful perhaps as in the court cases as well.
Yeah, I would add, I don't think that the particular cases are particularly helpful, but the amount of net litigation is changing the conversation. So first of all, keeping the cases in the headlines keeps the legislatures and people paying attention to the fight, because the alternative is the absence of the creative community fighting the training use, and that would be a concession that it's over. I think so. There's a lot coming out of those continual cases, even though a lot of the conversation is wrong. It's also bringing both sides to the table for increasing amount of licensing. Certainly in the video space, we're seeing a fairly robust licensing regime. Video has some benefits because there's rights of publicity and not just copyright issues, which now you add the uncertainty of 50 different states. There's biometric data in that data set, and so now you have major statutory damages per use in Illinois and Nevada, and private right of action. And so the video training companies are fairly quick to come to the table, and those are some of the largest of the AI companies. So they've come to the table. That licensing has come. Publishers increasingly are coming to the table. Photography, licensors. Now, whether it's rolling down to the individual creative artist, I think is a different issue. But right, so over the course of time, now that we've started to have a meaningful license economy start to emerge, now we can move back to copyright policy. I've always viewed the Copyright Act as the greatest act of public-private collective bargaining in the world, right? So every company is at the table when the Copyright Act is being negotiated, right? That's how we got the Fairness in Music Act, and restaurants don't have to pay, but it's 20 years longer to pay for the fact that restaurants don't have to pay, right? It's all that collective bargaining. And so these cases aren't going to be meaningful in themselves, but they're going to set up a conversation, whether that's 3 years or 10 years from now, as to what the model will look like.
Yeah, I really appreciate Joan's point about litigation, keeping the public spotlight on these issues, because it's also important to consider kind of the court of public opinion, and that there is a broad swath of the public that really feels that that this is unethical. Even people who aren't creatives, who aren't sitting in this room, who aren't in the industry, whose sympathies side with creatives in the creative industries, and it's really, I think, important to, as John said, keep the spotlight on that. Keep pushing, keep helping, using, litigation is part of the strategy, to keep demonstrating that there is a fight here, and there's a fight worth having. I'll just add that there is a kind of backlash already that you see against AI creativity. So back to the question of success, if people feel like, of course, probably most people in this room have heard the term. There's already a term that people use, AI slop, right? They feel their social media feeds, their YouTube feeds, whatever, are kind of getting filled with AI created content. I know my kids are teenagers, and if they see something, they can identify something that's AI created immediately. And if they see it's created by AI, they turn it off. Like they have zero interest in it. There are music producers who are saying, 3 years ago, people were coming to us, bands were coming to us, that wanted kind of everything to be perfected, and if it included using AI tools to kind of, they call it snapping it to the grid. Every beat, even a live drum performance could be sort of quantized so that everything was on the beat. Now the opposite is happening. Creatives are doing what they can to kind of move away from. They don't want to sound anything like AI. They want the mistakes in the recordings. They want to use live instruments. They don't want to have any of the kind of AI taint that might turn off audiences, and I think this is also, I think all part of this broader question of what's happening right now in terms of, the perception of AI, whether it's, certainly on the legal side and litigation, but also more reputationally within society.
Yeah, and I guess just speaking personally as somebody who's played around with AI tools value in having a tool that is trained on a smaller data set and a more custom data set that can do what you want it to do and isn't like pulling in all this garbage of other, other people's taste, other people's, slop, right? And I think that relies on having fairly trained data, licensed data, customized data that, understands. You understand where the data is coming from. You understand that it is fairly trained, it's paid for, and it's more often than not, it's your data, right? You've fed it in, and you're limiting the data set that it's looking at so that you can get what you want out of the tool.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
I was just going to say, and that can absolutely be a selling point for going forward. AI companies presenting their models as having been sort of ethically trained, and you do see this.
Yeah, no, there are a number of companies that do that will either certify you or offer their tools that way. And when I was running the clinic, in my prior existence, we're working with artists who would use AI in their work, but they were using it with their own data, as I'm describing. But there was still like this challenge, like, well, am I actually going to use it for a client's work? Not sure. I'll use it for my own creative work, but I'm not ready yet to start using it for a client's work because I'm not so sure yet about that tool. So I think that's where people are waiting to get over the hurdle.
I think we are seeing that trend of small task-specific models that are trained on highly curated data. And that also brings in the need for open source models that can be fine-tuned on specific data, as well as data that can run on the edge, data that can run on models that can run on the edge, models that can run on your device, your iPhone, so that it is not it's not taking your data somewhere else, but it is processing and turning your data on your device.
I wonder why you say open source.
Because the open source models can typically learn on less compute.
And can be modified by others to do things that you haven't intended for them to do.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a trade-off. Open source models do, the safeguards can be stripped from open source models, so there's security risks. But the trade-off also on the benefit side is that they can be fine-tuned for very task-specific objectives.
I just wanted to comment on the ethically trained, because I think that's been one of Getty's big selling points, is that they have like everything's been trained on their, for their AI tool. So, from the perspective of somebody who has put photos up on Getty's site for licensing purposes, there's the way their royalties work is it's, divided across their entire library of photographers, fair enough. But they didn't really give us a chance to opt out, as I recall. I actually was like, as I was preparing in my short time, I was trying to go back through my emails to see if I ever got notice from Getty about like, oh, we're going to start training an AI to compete with you, and we're going to train it on your work. But we'll pay you like this less than a penny royalty for it. Instead, what I could find was an announcement from them saying, hey, we're doing this, we're going to pay you a royalty. And that, in the course of doing that, it'll get bigger over time. It was so, and they promote themselves as ethically, fully licensed, et cetera. And I was trying to go back through the terms of use and see if it even had the language that says, we can use it to train our service, et cetera. And I didn't see that in my contributor agreement. There may be another policy that I couldn't find as I was going through things. But, to me, I had kind of dismissed it until I went back to look through it today, because I don't have that many photos up there. And I'm like, wait a second, I don't even see where it says in my agreements that they can use my photos for this. So I think that's another thing we do have to consider with these like so-called ethically trained models is like, what are they being trained on? I know, yeah, it actually kind of pissed me off a little bit when I was looking at it earlier.
So I just want to take 1 second and come back to the open source technology, mainly because as lawyers in the room, people need to understand how this affects the use of AI in the practice of law, right? So open source models have the benefit that anybody in the tech community can look at the source code, and so potentially at least those can be faster in terms of responding to cybersecurity weaknesses in the source code. They're also, because they're open source and free, your own tech people can load them into your infrastructure and have local instances in your area, right? From a privacy and from a patent standpoint, you don't ever want to be sharing any pre-patent data. And so by having an open source model that you've trained solely within your own server system, you can take advantage of using some of those technologies. Whereas if you're using a cloud service, you're subject to having the right enterprise license and the right technical requirements to implement the technology. And we've seen a lot of failures in that. And so particularly since we're talking to a patent community, using local instances of open source models really are something that people need to be comfortable with.
So we promised that we were going to talk about national security as well. And there's an incident this week that caught a few of our eyes, where apparently Claude and OpenAI are both currently battling distillation attacks by Chinese competitors. And in these attacks, if folks have, I don't know if folks have heard of them or not have heard of them, but basically the competitors are accessing the AI models and extracting data to build competing Chinese models. And I got a little kick out of this, where Elon Musk was tweeting, Anthropic is guilty of stealing training data at massive scale and has had to pay multi-billion-dollar settlements for their theft. So, he's like having a moment of Schadenfreude or just pointing out the irony in the situation, both of which must have been a lot of fun for him. But the national security challenges are obviously real, right? I mean, you're doing data mining and taking these assets, training data assets and other assets without the associated export controls or any other safeguards that might be built in.
Well, I mean, there's AI can be used in the offensive front as well as the defensive front. So these companies are working on using AI to identify when these attacks are happening, when you see 20 million bots making inquiries, or where you're seeing multi-head Hydra sort of technical infrastructure using to make queries of these models so that they can extract information, so they can extract data, so they can extract how these models are structured. So I think that is something that's going to evolve, where you see sort of the AI offensive against the AI defensive. And I think that's just going to be a push and pull evolve.
I would say Elon Musk is the world's biggest hypocrite because he has built his business on IP theft or low price purchases. But Grok is the worst offender when it comes to accuracy and of data and any sort of IP guardrails. I mean, when it first launched, and I see a certain person's not in the room, but I was able to go to Grok and generate pictures of literally a party with Darth Vader, Mickey Mouse, and Bart Simpson. No guardrails whatsoever. And he has intentionally adjusted the algorithms. I mean, I think it's not the same as an attack, but it's kind of an attack from within when you can adjust the algorithms to specifically address certain political bets or issues like that. I think there's, and we've seen it when Grok started calling itself Mecha Hitler. I mean, so these all, I think, weigh into national security when you start getting into the disinformation side of things that can sway public opinion and can, be misused. I think also there's one of the things I did a presentation recently for journalists in the Czech Republic of all places. And in doing my research, I did cover disinformation and misinformation. And one of the things I learned about was LLM seeding. And I don't know if people have heard that term, but it's kind of, Russia in particular is using it as one of their new propaganda approaches. I think it was Wired magazine that did a really good report on this. I can't recall if it was Wired, but I think it was.
404 Media.
It was a 404, and it was one of the two of those. And it was a really good report where they talked. So what's happening is we've already had these situations where like they will throw up websites that look like real news sites. And what they're doing now is knowing that these AI bots are going out there and scouring these to build their the LLMs. They have started feeding these sites with more and more propaganda-oriented content, particularly relating to like the war in the Ukraine war. And so they're able to get these, through sheer volume and placement, they're able to get the LLMs to respond in a way that reflects the propaganda that they're out there feeding. And so I think that's another thing that these companies are going to have to be concerned with, because if they don't know the provenance of the data, it's like even with the early training, the stuff coming out of, forget which data set it was, had like C-sound material and stuff in it. So they're going to need to put like both ingesting data and outputting data, like better guardrails to avoid these kind of problems.
So we think about these problems without making copyright the answer to everything. I mean, I'm concerned that copyright then becomes like this tool that we lean on for every single problem that comes up. And is it really built to be that?
No.
I mean, we think that it is or it isn't. I mean, I think you guys are the smart ones here.
I think you're right there in the mix, Sandra. I think one of our problems, I hate to say it, is the First Amendment, which we take as sacrosanct. And having done my LLM and my
end here first, the First Amendment is a problem
in this context, right? Because the big response to the First Amendment has always been counter speech, but there's no counter speech that can move at the speed of AI. Or even the speed of the internet, really. I mean, that's really where things started. And having done my research, like for my LLM in the UK and on the EU law, the way rights are balanced in other countries that don't put speech as like the foremost pinnacle of stuff, I think we don't see the same, we see better ability to regulate outside of copyright, which does have a basis in the Constitution. So how do you balance anything against a constitutional right that we consider sacrosanct?
So I would just a couple additional comments to that. So again, if you look at the Constitution, so the two questions come back to, maybe we can capture the tradition and history, new version of the Supreme Court to re-educate on some of these issues, right? Both copyright and the First Amendment have dramatically morphed from their historical origins over the past 50 years. First Amendment wasn't even mentioned by the Supreme Court until 1925. We think of it as having this foundational basis, but it really didn't. And it didn't take off until the 1960s in the Civil Rights Movement, and it became the linchpin of protecting the journalists who were promoting the Civil Rights era, and it grew and grew and grew. But this last summer in Paxton versus NetChoice, the Supreme Court, for the first time, applied a standard other than strict scrutiny, applying only intermediate scrutiny to allow Texas and Florida to have age verification laws, saying this is right. Not being entirely clear why, whether it was commercial speech or whether it was just not sufficiently interfering with First Amendment rights. But that case really signals an openness of the court. Again, if you look at the history, the exceptionalism that the First Amendment had wasn't really originally there. And so there is the potential that the court is backing off on some of those decisions. Copyright similarly has a history that's unmoored from its constitutional origins. Jane Ginsburg and Sean O'Connor have done a lot of work to show that when copyright was being founded, not only did it have its Lockean notions of natural law, but there was also a strong French influence, moral rights, something that we haven't really talked about yet, but moral rights are missing from U.S. copyright. That would create that privacy balance. Privacy law is missing from U.S. law, which is based on common law copyright. That's where the origins of privacy law came from Warren and Brandeis. And so if we actually start to dig into the history of both copyright and the First Amendment from a founder's perspective, there's plenty of room for the court to create some balance. And finally, again, First Amendment creates certain issues, but copyright isn't the answer. The Commerce Clause is, right? Ultimately, what we're talking about is the AI companies desperately need for us to have a database right. And a database right would give them positive law because there's no evidence that strip mining your training data is illegal. It wasn't illegal for them to strip mine it the first time, so there's no reason for it to be illegal for them to strip mine it back, right? It's illegal in Europe and in Asia because of database laws. And the quid pro quo for better database protection is a license model for the content that's going into the database. And so I do think that these attacks and the need for the infrastructure that we have will in fact bring the parties to the table and allow us to have a slightly different model going forward. But I want to just come back for 1 minute to what Danielle was saying about the seeding, because I don't think people recognize just how incredibly dangerous the manipulation of these AIs is by Russia in particular and China, because there is a very, very active campaign to create public disinformation. You recall the 2017 the elections, what happened with Facebook, and the ability to manipulate there. These are orders of scale bigger. The amount of headlines that people are generating from their AIs rather than their news feeds is now 80% of content. The headlines are coming from that source, and to the extent that those headlines have been compromised by Russia as part of its disinformation campaign, we have a real national crisis coming.
And even as a small business owner, I'm constantly getting bombarded by ads say about how I can optimize my own profile within AI by, generating content and stuff that will get the AI to pick me up. And I'm just like, leave me alone. I don't want that many clients anyways. I don't have the time for it. But it's, how do you instead, it used to be search engine optimization, right? Now it's AI optimization. So it's the same concept.
So I'm having too much fun. I didn't realize we had gone so long. I want to give you each an opportunity to give the audience an assignment, or give Congress an assignment, or whoever you want to give an assignment to ensure that we are doing what we can to ensure national success for the U.S. in IP, as you have each defined it. So just quickly go down the line.
Sure. I think more data, economic modeling data on the distribution of where the money goes from creators to distributors to platforms. I think that would be helpful information.
So as you heard from my opening comments, I'm worried about what's going on in education, from K through 12, higher education, legal education. We heard from an earlier panel about the fact that the academic community is anti-IP. That's an overstatement, but what is an accurate statement is the best funded IP programs in the country at the most elite institutions have a very strong bias in that direction. I applaud all of you who funded this conference and who are funding IPPI. And I would encourage you, right, here's your call, or call to action, entirely self-interested, right? IPPI is not alone. You have Franklin Pierce, you have Nova, you have centers around the country that have students who are willing to be pro-IP, but we're not being funded the way Berkeley is. And so step up, help the institutions that want to help you create the interns on the Hill and the legislators and the next generation of lawyers. Fund those programs that have your agenda so that we can educate the next generation of lawyers.
Okay. I guess my assignment would be to start thinking about what a future with licensing of copyrighted works that are used in AI training and, as Danielle was talking about, are not just sort of studied, but replicated and no doubt drawn upon in the creation of generative AI, and looking at possibilities for sort of micropayments and licensing models. One example I use from the music industry is not AI related, but Spotify performs trillions of streams globally annually, many trillions of streams globally annually, and pays out tiny micropayments on behalf of each of those streams to many, many copyright owners globally. They have the infrastructure to do it. What would a model that sort of can somehow quantify and track the usage of trained creative copyrighted data in generative AI products look like that would actually take a kind of ongoing royalty or ongoing licensing scheme seriously? Because I do have some concerns about the kind of again, as Danielle talked about, sort of ethically trained AI models using copyrighted works. They, on the one hand, I think it's much better than unethically trained models, but the kind of lump sum payments up front don't necessarily ultimately, make their way back to creators, or in the grand scheme of things are a very small amount for the value of the works being used. So that's just kind of something I've been thinking about.
Well, since I only had a couple hours to think this up, I'm going to give you the same assignment I give my students at the beginning of the semester. And if anybody wants the actual prompts, you're welcome to email me. But experiment with the tools to understand what they can and can't do, because I think, we can't understand how to regulate, litigate, work against them, work with them, whatever, unless you understand them to some extent. And, the technology papers, unless you're on the computer side, are a little tough to understand. The one assignment that is like mandatory for my students at the beginning of the semester is to go to a chatbot and ask it what are the key issues relating to AI in the entertainment industry, whatever prompt they want to use, as long as that's the gist of it. And then at the end of the semester, they're asked to and they have to post it publicly so that they can each see how different chatbots respond and how it might respond to different prompts and how it might, depend on what that student has been using it for. And then actually for one of my classes, their exam was to go back and reassess that and to discuss like the legal issues that it kind of missed, or how it, how they perceive it differently based on what we've actually studied. So it's interesting to do that with something that you are an expert on, to ask like ChatGPT or one of the public chatbots, what are the issues in my area of expertise, whatever it is, and see what you think of that response. And that's, it gives you a sense of what other people out there are seeing.
To Scott's point, have a conversation with empathy, right? Yep. All right. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the audience.